2016 primary election debates. With us today are Senator Haley Waits and Mr. Daniel Fiazzo. Now let's hear from the candidates.
My name is Haley Waits, and I'm a senator from New York, and I'm running for President of the United States.
I'm Daniel Fiazzo, businessman and entrepreneur. Elect me as your next president, and I promise to make America great again.
Our first topic of discussion is the use of biofuels. To introduce this topic, we'll start with a video.
We all know that it takes a lot of fuel to keep our country running, right? Cars, trucks, planes, trains. What if we could develop a homegrown renewable source for those fuels? Well, good news. We already are.
The term biofuel is usually used to describe liquid fuels such as ethanol and biodiesel that are used as replacements for transportation fuels like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Ethanol is an alcohol formed by fermentation. It is used as a replacement for or additive to gasoline. Biodiesel is an oil produced by extracting naturally occurring oils from plants and seeds. Biodiesel can be combusted in diesel engines or blended with diesel fuel. Biofuels are grouped in three categories based on the type of feedstock used to produce them. First-generation biofuels are produced from food crops. For ethanol, feedstocks include sugarcane, corn, maize, and others. For biodiesel, feedstocks are naturally occurring vegetable oils such as soybean and canola. Second-generation biofuels are produced from cellulosic material such as wood, grasses, and inedible parts of plants. This material is more difficult to break down through fermentation and therefore requires pre-treatment before it can be processed. Third-generation biofuels are produced using the lipid production from algae. In addition, the term advanced biofuels is used to describe the relatively new technological field of biofuel production that uses waste such as garbage, animal fats, and spent cooking oil to produce liquid fuels. Biofuels are currently the only viable replacement to petroleum transportation fuels because they can be used in existing combustion engines. This is an increasingly important advantage with growing concern about the environmental impacts of fossil fuels around the globe. Biofuels can also help provide energy security in regions that do not have hydrocarbon resources but do have suitable agricultural conditions. While there is some dispute over just how renewable biofuels are, it is generally accepted that the crops used to produce them can be replenished much faster than fossil fuels, which take millions of years to form. Concerns about biofuels are usually centered around the fact that they are an agricultural product. Producing these biofuel crops can mean competition with other natural resources, particularly land, food, and water. First-generation biofuels use only edible crops, which has led to biofuel crops displacing food sources in certain regions and subsequent spikes in food prices. In many regions of the world, subsidies are provided for these crops, which only amplifies these issues. In addition, increased agriculture of any form comes with concerns of deforestation and biodiversity loss, as well as water and fertilizer use, which have environmental and climate impacts all to their own. That's biofuels.
Senator Waits, after watching this video, can you explain your opinion on biofuels to the audience, please?
Well, in my opinion, as our economy continues to grow and expand, so will our consumption of fossil fuels such as oil and coal. However, by continuing to use those limited resources, we will remain dependent on foreign suppliers, continue to further pollute our country, and be faced with a real problem when the supply of oil becomes more scarce and more pricey. That is why the use of biofuels would be beneficial to America and its economy. We would not be polluting at high amounts of CO2 that destroys the atmosphere, and instead be using biofuels to transition to zero-emission technology. Nor would we be concerned with our dependence on the price of oil. It is in my opinion that biofuels would be a benefit to America's economy, not only allowing it to become more independent, but also creating a new industry that creates jobs and boosts local economies while at the same time creating a better environment.
And Mr. Fiazzo, what's your position on the subject?
Despite recent support for the production and use of biofuels, I'm against all government subsidies that support this issue. The reason that I oppose government support for the production of biofuels include the high cost of production, the shortage of food in poor countries, and the industrial pollution that production generates. The most worrisome of recent criticisms of biofuels relate to their impact on the natural environment. In the U.S., water shortages due to the huge volumes necessary to produce grains into ethanol are a key issue in my argument against biofuel production. Another key issue is greenhouse gas. Many believe that biofuels would significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which is simply untrue. The nitrogen necessary to grow crops for biofuel releases large amounts of nitrous oxide into the atmosphere, a greenhouse gas 296 times more damaging than CO2, and contributes more to global warming than biofuels save through fossil fuel reduction. Also, to replace just 10% of the gasoline use in the United States with ethanol and biodiesel, it would require 43% of the current U.S. cropland to be used for biofuel feedstocks, which significantly reduces the amount of land that can be used to raise other crops.
Okay, let's ask our first question. Do you think biofuels are a feasible replacement to decrease our dependency on foreign oil? Mr. Fiazzo, you may answer first.
I do not believe that the use of biofuels would decrease our dependency on foreign oil. Biofuels are not yet economical, nor are they scalable. Biofuels are dependent upon crops or land resources which are limited, and because they are limited, it is not feasible to scale the production of biofuels where they would be able to entirely replace our need for oil. We would be diverting the use of agricultural land to the production of crops to use for biofuels, which is both harmful for the agriculture industry and the environment. Because of the negative repercussions scaling the use of biofuels would cause, it would be illogical to increase the production of biofuel to decrease our dependence on foreign oil.
Senator Waits, would you care to respond?
Although my opponent believes that the production of biofuels will decrease our dependency on foreign oil and would have negative side effects with increased production of biomass farming, I do not. It is understandable to believe that in order to use biofuels to decrease our dependency on foreign oil, we would have to convert much of our agricultural farmland to biomass-producing centers. However, this is not what I am advocating for. What I am advocating for is for the U.S. to use more biofuels to replace our dependency on foreign oil, not necessarily have a complete overhaul of our agricultural production systems or forests in order to meet demand. Farms all around the U.S. have converted to biomass production or are only using part of their total crops to sell as biomass to create biofuels. We can encourage greater production of biomass on the home front without entirely converting the agricultural system and still have adequate food production as well. We can also purchase biofuels made in neighboring countries like Brazil or Argentina that would further decrease our dependency on foreign oil, which is not only significantly worse for the environment, but also puts money into the hands of countries we know to have groups and organizations within them that we know to be terrorists. This is a basic problem of supply and demand. As you can see from the graph I'm showing, that in the foreign oil market, if there is a change in demand of oil, in this instance, if their demand for oil goes down because we don't need to use oil as much as if we are using biofuels, there won't be as much as a supply of oil, meaning there won't be as much polluting oil consumed.
Very well. Now, in reference to global warming, do you think biofuels will either help or harm mitigating its effects?
Clearly, the use of biofuels will help to mitigate the effects of global warming. Biofuels are designed to replace our need for fossil fuels. They are already being used in many of our cars, trucks, and other forms of transportation. Therefore, it is easy to see why biofuels will help global warming because they produce far less CO2 than conventional oil and gasoline when used. They are a great alternative that can and should be used right now because, as stated on the website EarthEasy, the auto fleet will continue to rely on the liquid fuels for some time, meaning oil. However, biofuels are today's primary alternatives to oil. Until better forms of alternative transportation and sources of energy, like electric power, are further developed, biofuels are our best option.
Mr. Fiazzo.
It has been stated that the use of biofuels in place of fossil fuels will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. However, research has found that emissions will actually rise in the short run because of the destroyed pasture and forest areas that will have to be converted for the production of biomass, which is used to make biofuel. It could take 2 or more decades for emissions to decrease, unless the conversion of forest land is avoided. In the long run, biofuels may have a positive impact on the environment, but right now there are serious environmental issues to overcome before they can be a viable replacement for fossil fuels. This chart shows the carbon debt and carbon debt payback time for a number of different biofuel sources. The top chart shows the amount of carbon debt that these countries would incur if they were to convert their native ecosystems into biofuel production. As you can see, it will have substantial effects on the amount of carbon both above and below the Earth's surface. The bottom graph shows the amount of time it will take to repay the carbon debt if these native ecosystems were to be converted into biomass production. Again, you can see that the immense amount of time it would take for the carbon debt to be replaced.
I see we have a question from the audience. Go ahead, miss.
Hi, my name is Riley. I have a question for both the candidates. What about the ecosystems? In your opinion, would biofuels help or harm them?
Great question. Biofuel production and processing practices release large amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Fertilizer application, which is necessary for growing the crops to produce biofuels, releases nitrous oxide into the atmosphere, a very potent greenhouse gas that damages the ozone layer. Also, most biorefineries operate using fossil fuels, and some research suggests that greenhouse gas emissions resulting from biofuel production and use may actually be higher than those generated by the sole use of fossil fuels. Another problem is land use patterns, which could increase greenhouse gas emissions by releasing terrestrial carbon stocks into the atmosphere. Therefore, if the production of biofuel were to increase, it would significantly harm local and global ecosystems through nitrification and greenhouse gas emissions.
Senator Waits.
Well, my answer to that question would be no. Biofuels would help most ecosystems because of their long-term effects. Biofuels can be created from a number of sources, such as food crops, forest acreage, and even algae. Therefore, it is not just crops that can be used to create them, where many of the fertilizers you described are used. However, there are more sustainable methods of farming that can be used if we are to increase biomass production from crops, therefore reducing the excess nitrogen input from farming. Also, by using biofuels, you are reducing CO2 emissions in the long run, which benefits all types of ecosystems because it is mitigating the effects of global warming.
Next topic. Does the creation of biofuels harm global food prices?
Yes, it does, especially in poor countries, that these price increases pose direct threats to disposable income and food security. In these third world countries, the run-up in food prices would threaten the more than 1 billion of the world's poor who are chronically food insecure. Poor farmers in these countries can barely support a household on a subsistence basis and have little, if any, surplus production to sell. The market supply curve for food crops is strongly influenced by the availability of land, labor, water, and fertilizer. If biofuel production competes for these resources with food crop producers, then the supply curve for food production will be heavily affected. A greater demand for biofuel will lead to higher food prices, either through increased competition for inputs such as land, water, fertilizer, and labor, or through international trade.
Senator Waits.
In my opinion, no. Biofuels are not the real cause of higher food prices and shortages. The real reason behind these issues are an increased global demand from a growing world population, as well as higher gas prices, which are leading to increased costs for the transportation of these foods. Not to mention that this increased use of transportation means more consumption of oil, more CO2 emissions, and therefore an increase in the effects of global warming. This means that globally, other crops and other sources of food are exposed to increased temperatures, less fresh water, and other weather extremes, which decreases the overall number of crops available because they can't survive this harsh climate. By using biofuels, this would decrease the demand for fossil fuels and therefore decrease the cost of food transportation, ultimately decreasing food prices. In addition, there are other sources besides food sources that can be used to produce biofuels. One example, as I've mentioned, is algae. Research says that 10 million gallons of biofuel can be produced from 100 acres of algae. Biofuels are, therefore, not the true cause of food prices and shortages, and actually would help alleviate the food crisis.
For our final topic of discussion, should the government continue to subsidize the research and development for biofuels?
Yes, I believe that governments should subsidize biofuels in order to promote finding alternative forms of energy that can help reduce our nation's dependence on foreign oil. Subsidizing biofuels promotes more research in alternative energy, which will help reduce climate change and provide energy for the future. Alternative energy is most developed in countries where government subsidies have been in place for some time. This would put the United States at the forefront of alternative and renewable energy research if we continue to expand subsidies for alternative fuel sources like biofuels.
Mr. Fiazzo.
Huge government subsidies are being directed at biofuel industries that could better be spent elsewhere. In addition, it should be recognized that any industry that requires heavy subsidization, as biofuels do, are generally more likely to be unsustainable long-term in the marketplace. In the case of alternative energy sources, the marketplace is better off when firms compete with one another and seek profit at their own risk.
Thank you, Senator Waits and Mr. Fiazzo. Now, do we have any final questions from our audience before we wrap up? Yes.
I was wondering what the economic costs and benefits of biofuels are.
In order to be an economically viable solution to fossil fuels, biofuels should provide a net energy gain, have environmental benefits, be economically competitive, and be producible in large quantities without reducing food supplies. My research has shown that the production of biofuels do not meet any of these criteria. Firstly, to refine biofuels to a more efficient energy output and to build the necessary manufacturing plants to increase biofuel quantities, a high initial investment is often required. Also, aside from the concern over food shortage and air pollution, my research suggests that production of biofuel feedstocks, particularly food crops such as corn and soy, could increase water pollution with pesticides and sediment, depleting the availability of readily drinkable water.
Senator Waits, would you care to respond?
In my opinion, I would disagree and say that biofuels are economically viable. Biofuels can be produced locally, which would decrease our nation's dependency on foreign energy and can help stimulate growth in local economies. Because biofuels are produced locally, biofuel manufacturing plants can employ hundreds or even thousands of workers, creating new jobs in rural areas. Also, by reducing dependence on fuel supplies, we can protect the integrity of our energy resources and make them safe from outside influences while also remaining economically independent and investing within our borders instead of sending money outward. Biofuel production will also increase the demand for sustainable biofuel crops, providing economic stimulation to the agricultural industry, not only at home but also worldwide.
And our time for this discussion has run out, which concludes our first topic of tonight's debate. We'll be back shortly after the commercial break with our next topic.
The proposition of replacing fossil fuels with biofuels is a controversial topic in current news. There are many positive effects that their use could bring, but there are also many downfalls with their production and the time that it takes for them to have a positive impact. Biofuels may be a smart economic decision in the short run, but in the long run, other fuel alternatives should be considered and used. We believe that right now the possibility of biofuels completely replacing fossil fuels is not the best choice for the economy or for the environment. We think that the government should attempt to develop the right technology and processes that could reduce the emissions that are released from the production of the biofuel plants. Then they can start to implement biofuels more as a significant alternative or replacement to the fossil fuels that we currently rely on.